host of Classic Business on radio in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and anchor of the Covid-19 Business Watch Daily Show on Business Day TV, and editor too for my sins of Catalyst Private Equity magazine. Now, I hope you've got your coffee and a notebook handy as we're set to deliver some rich insights during the next 60 minutes as we embark on a journey down the rabbit hole of the rule of law under the national state of disaster that we've been operating under for roughly 8 weeks now. Thank you to the Mail and Guardian for putting this together, and I'd just like to use this as a plug for one of my favorite newspapers. I'm not in any way affiliated to the M&G apart from hosting this event for them, but I do support good journalism and quality journalism, and the Mail and Guardian is certainly amongst the best in the country. So go on and get a subscription to the M&G if you don't already, so we can support a free, strong and independent media, which is what we need, particularly at this time in our fledgling democracy's history. Thank you to the Law Society of South Africa for sponsoring this webinar on COVID-19, eased lockdown and the rule of law. That's the official title. And I'd like to thank our presenters too. Let me just tell you a little bit more about the Law Society before I introduce your presenters for today. Since 1998, I believe, the Law Society has brought together the Black Lawyers Association, the National Association of Democratic Lawyers and Provincial Attorneys Associations, and in representing the attorneys' professions in South Africa, it aims to promote on a national basis the common interests of members and the profession, and obviously the welfare of the profession, having regard at all times to the broader interest of the public whom the profession serves, and to endeavour to reconcile where there may conflict the interests of the profession and the public. So a great pleasure to have the Law Society of South Africa on board. Our first guest has just got a little bit of trouble, it seems, with his internet connection, so I'll wait for him to re-enter the room. William Booth is our second speaker today, Criminal Law Committee Chairperson, Cape-based attorney who is very well known, so good at his job that the thugs try regularly to try and ensure his departure from this mortal coil, and they have not succeeded, thankfully. William, he's a world or national treasure, I should say, a criminal defence attorney. He was the chairperson of the former Cape Law Society's Criminal Law Committee, and currently the chairperson of the Law Society of South Africa's Criminal Law Committee 2. He also serves on the Law Society of South Africa's Legal Aid Committee and was formerly a councillor of the Cape Law Society and of the Law Society of South Africa as well. So William, thanks so much for joining us as we wait for Advocate Mvuzo Notyesi, who's an attorney and director at Mvuzo Notyesi, to join us. I'll just go through some of his CV. He's president of the National Association of Democratic Lawyers. He holds a BProc and LLB degree from the University of Transkei and was admitted as an attorney in the late 1990s. He's been a council member and a member of the management committee of the Law Society of South Africa for 3 years. He also represents the Law Society on the Judicial Service Commission and is chairperson of the Notyesi Foundation, which awards bursaries to disadvantaged students to attend university. So fantastic initiative that, and is also a board member of SAFLI and an advocate of women empowerment and access to justice by disadvantaged communities. So Advocate, thanks so much for agreeing to join us for a fascinating webinar, as I'm sure many South Africans are operating in an environment where not only are we cold in Johannesburg and in Cape Town, but we also feel the chill of operating in a democratic country under a national state of disaster. What does that mean for the rule of law? Just the other day, we had Chief Justice Mogoeng saying that the lockdown and the state of national disaster are not above the Constitution, and he implored South African citizens to, if they felt that their rights in terms of the Constitution were being roughed up, that they should approach the courts to ensure that their rights were upheld. So quite strong words that from the Chief Justice. Just some housekeeping rules, Advocate, before I hand over to you. Just to welcome the audience, we've got almost, I think, just over now 1,000 registrants and delegates from all over the country. From Claremont, I'm just seeing Mareka here, Nosipo from TMN Gomo and Associates in Pretoria. So really, thank you very much for joining us. You won't have access to speak directly to the presenters. 1,000 people is just too unwieldy, but please keep your questions coming in the chat function, and we'll try and get through as many of those as possible. There's a poll screen later on, and I'd really encourage you to go and vote on the poll, just so we can get a sense of the mood and the sentiment towards the national state of disaster. Advocate Nochesi, just as an opening comment, before we get to some of the specific questions, what do you make of the current environment in which we find ourselves in South Africa?
Thank you very much, and thank you to good afternoon to the listeners and those that are in attendance. Firstly, one, we appreciate that as the president of the state, that the coronavirus has put us into uncharted areas. It has brought us in areas that we have never thought about. Our life has completely and fundamentally changed. The declaration of the national state of disaster by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and the subsequent lockdown that followed thereafter could change our life completely. It has impacted in society in various ways. And therefore, that called into action the arms of government that they must be put into effect. That is the three arms of government, the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. But during the state of the lockdown and the national state of disaster, we've seen, we've heard our complaints, the abuse of powers and brutalities by the police, and all sort of complaints. And there has been a perception that the constitution has been suspended. All those matters brings us together to discuss what really are the key was the response meted out by the state, by the government of South Africa, proportionate to the need to curb the spread of the virus. Of course, I must emphasize that, a matter of fact, a national disaster by its very nature requires a rapid and effective response. That is the position. In so doing, those in authority are expected to act in accordance with the South African Constitution and must be diligent and accountable to ensure that when exercising public power, they do so within the context and within the ambit of the Constitution. Have we seen that?
Advocate?
Yes.
Advocate, I just need to interject quickly, if you'll allow me. Advocate, I just need to interject quickly. A lot of the comments that we're getting relate to the quality of the audio. Apologies for having to interrupt you midstream. If you could perhaps just get a little bit closer to the mic on your laptop, and hopefully that will improve the audio quality. I do think it's just a bit of a bad line, but we'd really like for the delegates to hear what it is that you have to say.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that. But where I am, I'm saying the management of the state of disaster requires that those who are entrusted with the power, they should act with accountability, they must act with due diligence, and they must ensure that they act within context of the Constitution. To some critical questions, as we have seen, there's been a perception that in view of the KFU regulations were passed, but some of these regulations, in our view, they have been disproportionate. The far-reaching extent that one would sense that the behavior was as if the Constitution has been suspended. Hence, therefore, we now see a number of court challenges and in relation to those regulations. The recent is about 3 cases, the case that come as a result of the soldiers' actions, the law enforcement actions, the TA case that is due to constitutional court and case that is almost underway. But very importantly, we all have to accept that the national state of disaster was never a design to suspend the constitution, but it was purely a response to the spread of the virus. Obviously, the pandemic has impacted society in a drastic way with extraordinary sacrifices by our country and by our own people, because we have to give up on some of the important rights that we have in terms of the constitution. Critical, therefore, one has to examine the question of whether the responses that have been given in terms of the regulation.
Oh, I think we finally lost the
Particularly
advocates.
that of the state of the National Disaster Management Act. And can you hear me?
We've got you back there, advocate, but I think what I'm going to do
Sorry?
for now is just hand over to William Booth, and let's just try and advocate, we can hear you. We've lost your video feed though. So William, I'm going to hand over to you and get your opening comments on where we find ourselves. I think the major concern, as the advocate rightly mentioned, is this overreach, this belief among some in the organs of state, PSAPs in particular, that the constitution has somehow been suspended under this national state of disaster. What are your opening comments? Oh, William, your audio is not on. If you can just ensure that you've unmuted. Have you unmuted yourself, William? I can't hear you, so it still sounds like you've muted yourself. Thanks for all the comments, everyone coming in, letting me know that William needs to unmute himself. William, can you hear me? Can you just unmute yourself, please? Advocate, can you hear me?
Hello?
Advocate, not. Yes, advocate. I think we should pick up from where you left off just while William Booth sorts his technical issues out.
Yes. Now, where I am, I'm saying is that we have to then, in this context of this discussion that we have today, also take into account the president's speech from last night. Obviously, what transpired from the president's speech last night, these critical issues comes out that the curfew has now will be lifted. People can go and buy goods or obtain services. People can exercise at any time of the day, but not in groups. Alcohol can be sold at bottle stores from Mondays to Thursday, and there will be specific hours in terms of the regulations that will be following. There should be no gathering except for funerals with maximum 50 people or workplace meetings. Partial of spiritual worship and counseling services will have to wait for the regulations. We'll have to wait for regulation as to sporting events. So we have to, the restaurants, cinemas, casinos, entertainment centers, they are still closed. This is the president's speech last night, because obviously that will form part of the subsequent regulations and the draft cover for the areas that were put. But what is very important is the questions that we have to ask ourselves is the state of disaster itself. What is real? What is the state? What does the act? How does it?
Oh, advocate, it looks like we've lost your line as well, as we just ejected William Booth for him to reset because of his audio issues. And to help reset your audio issues now as well. We've got a lot of questions coming through, so please do keep them coming. And I do apologize about this. We were hoping that the internet gods would be on our side as we all navigate this new normal of webinars and Zoom meetings and all the rest of it. There's some great questions coming through. And so while we try and get our two presenters back in the line, I'd just like to share with you some of the numbers. So far, we've had 230,000 people arrested for violating lockdown regulations. 230,000, a remarkable figure in anyone's books, especially when you consider that we've had no major arrests for 10 years of state capture. We've got William Booth back with us at the moment. William, thanks so much. I hope your audio is up and running now. Over to you.
Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure what happened, but we're entering even more of a technical age these days. So I think thank you to COVID-19 for that. I think that was a plus. Michael, yes, I said earlier, thank you very much for hosting. I think we are in most extraordinary times, and this has affected all professions, and in particular the legal profession. Some lawyers are certainly entitled to go to court. They have been registered as part of the essential services, but it's been a very difficult and hard road from the first time that lockdown started. As far as the issue goes with regard to understanding the law since lockdown, it has been rather problematic. We've had numerous regulations that have been promulgated in terms of the Disaster Management Act. And I think for many lawyers, it's been a battle to understand some of the regulations. And every time there seems to be changes, it's badly drafted in many instances and changes too regularly. In fact, I believe that there should have been more involvement initially with regard to the drafting of the regulation by lawyers in general. That didn't take place. We now have situations where some of these regulations are being challenged in court, and I think that is something that should not have happened. The way the regulations are being enforced, I think, is a huge, huge issue. Here we're talking about law enforcement, and I know we were all thrust into the pandemic with very little warning, but I believe that many members of police and other law enforcement organizations have not been properly trained as to deal with these unusual times that we find ourselves in now. The question, though, that one must immediately ask is, why have they not been trained? Because they should have been trained in any event to deal with members of the public, particularly at roadblocks. There's been a lot of complaint that citizens are being stopped, being unnecessarily questioned, in some instances even being assaulted. Law enforcement must realize they're there to serve the nation, and most importantly, they're there to uphold the law. The rule of law, the Constitution, is still in place. And it seems that many law enforcement officials tend to forget that. Even when people go to a police station just to seek some guidance and advice, to have a form filled in, they are often treated in a very improper manner and in some instances, in fact, very rudely. And that's not acceptable.
William, what are my rights if I am in breach potentially or allegedly in one of the lockdown or of one of the lockdown's many regulations? Does a lockdown fine mean I get a criminal record? And if I'm arrested, what are my rights?
Yes, you will get a criminal record if you pay the admission of guilt fine. And I think that there's been so much debate about that. I'm on a group of lawyers throughout South Africa, and we've debated this, the whole issue of admission of guilt fines, and the fact that if you pay an admission of a guilt fine, that will lead to a criminal record. And many citizens are not aware of that. They get stopped and they say, well, let's just get rid of the case. Let's just pay the 500 Rand admission of guilt, not realizing that that becomes a criminal record. In a year or two's time, when you apply for a job and you apply for police clearance certificate, that pops up. So that is a huge problem. It becomes a criminal record. The way you should deal with this is if you are stopped and you are fined in the sense of handed a document with an admission of guilt fine on it, that you should approach the prosecuting authorities and ask them to consider withdrawing the charges, particularly if they're petty offenses. I've found that many people are being stopped for extremely petty offenses, sometimes not even contravening the regulations. You're walking across the road to go and buy a loaf of bread, sometimes getting lost and then being found in another area. I had a matter where there were two Swedish citizens and they got lost on their way to a supermarket. They were arrested, kept in custody for 24 hours, and I got the case withdrawn. So I think the public needs to know, do not pay that admission of guilt. It will become a criminal record.
I think that's very important to understand. If you do find yourself in that situation, though, and being mindful of the fact that the public have seen instances of police abuse and police brutality, what is your advice? What would you advise the public to do?
Well, we've seen lots of videos out there how the police have behaved in an extremely irregular fashion. And obviously, criminal charges can be laid against the police. They can be reported to their superiors, the police ombudsman that you can lay complaints to. And in fact, if you suffer damages, let's say you are physically assaulted and suffer injury, you can sue the Minister of Police. But the point is this, none of this should be happening. If the police were properly trained and guided in how they must deal with the public, forget about COVID-19 in general. Even before the pandemic, there were many instances of police brutality and police not dealing with situations in the correct way, forgetting about the law. There have been directives from the various commissioners of police saying the police should only, and other law enforcement, should only arrest as a last resort. So if somebody's taking their dog for a walk, before they were allowed to take them for a walk between 6 and 9, and they don't have to necessarily be arrested, that police officer or law enforcement can issue them with a warning notice to go to court if it's felt that it's so serious that you need to go to court. Otherwise, why not just warn the person and say, don't do it again? Why have an arrest take place in any event?
There's a question here from Vera Creel, and then we'll come back to you, Mr. Nochezi, as you've joined us now without your visual on. So hopefully just with audio, the line will be more stable. Vera Creel, how must a citizen deal with SAPs that insist that a fine must be paid before release, therefore getting a criminal record without being allowed to state your case?
Well, call a lawyer. But sometimes it's very difficult to do that. You might not be allowed to make your phone call. You have to insist that you have, and in fact, let's just start by saying the police must advise you that you do not have to pay an admission of guilt. They should say to you, you have a right to take this matter to court. You have a right to approach the prosecutor to try and have the charge withdrawn. to prevent a criminal record. But in most instances, that does not take place. So let's say they force you to sign and to pay a fine. You can later have that set aside. You can approach the court to have that conviction overturned and set aside. But the police should know the regulations and the law, and this should never ever take place.
Mr. Norchesi, welcome back. I hope your audio is good.
Yes, no, I am. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. I've got a question here from Leanne Kirst, and she says we've received inquiries from clients pursuant to the announcement of level 3 coming into effect next week. I represent a couple scuba and swim schools and clubs and small training groups, max of 4 students, and they'd obviously like to scuba dive and commence training. Can institutions like SAMHSA and state companies like TMPA legitimately implement their own restrictions as to whether or not access to the ocean may be denied to private and commercial sea vessels? Mr. Norchesi? Oh, terrible line again. Internet gods are certainly not with Mr. Norchesi today. Let's go to another question, Mr. Norchesi. That's a little less technical. Let's go to another question that's a little less technical to accommodate your line. Talk to me about basics. Can I move house? Can my family and I move between provinces as we head into level 3? Mr. Norchesi?
I cannot get it at all.
You've got no audio. William, do you have an answer to that question?
Well, if it's rental, you're certainly allowed to move from the one rental to the other, even in level 4, as long as you've got proof that you are moving from one place to the other. As far as houses and purchasing, I think the same should actually apply. In other words, if you have proof that you're moving from one to the other, the regulations had actually indicated that you should obtain a permit from the police, and then it said you could obtain a permit from the magistrate's court, and then some people went to both the magistrate's court and the police, and they were told, well, you don't need that, you just need proof that you are moving from one place to the other. The issue with regard to obviously cross-provincial movement is a problem that was allowed at a point that you could move up till, I think it was the 7th of May, if you were moving to where you were working. Then the issue of moving home, you also were restricted with up to a certain period, but it seems now that's also gone. So, Michael, can I just say this is all very confusing. It's confusing to lawyers, and it keeps changing all the time. And when you have the president saying certain things, and when you see other ministers issuing the regulations, one wonders whether everybody is talking to everybody at government level to make the regulations simple and actually at the end of the day to allow people to get back to work as soon as possible, obviously under certain safety requirements. But the country is in a very, very bad state. It needs to get back to be able to be functioning properly, and that is people moving around. But the South African citizens, I think, also must realize they've got to comply with those safety requirements. But you can't force people. It doesn't seem to work.
What are the legalities? Let's talk about some of the health and safety measures here. And there seems to be a debate around whether or not you can be fined for not wearing a mask in public, for example. What are the legalities around mask wearing? If I go for my morning jog or walk between 6 and 9 and I see someone who isn't wearing a mask, do I to perform a citizen's arrest? What are the legalities around mask wearing?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask doesn't entail a criminal conviction. It's not a contravention which will then lead to, if you were arrested, receiving a fine. But obviously it's from the health point of view. And that is why I say citizens should realize that wearing the mask, doing the sanitation, doing the distancing, social distancing, are all part and parcel of trying to get the economy back where it was before. So not necessarily that you're going to receive a fine for if you don't wear a mask, but it's again the whole issue of being cautious and to prevent the situation worsening and prevent people becoming infected from other people.
On this whole issue of the National Command Council, there still seems to be a lot of debate on the validity of the National Command Council. Someone wading into that debate, Thabo Majoro, would like to get your view on whether or not it's a legal or an illegal body, and what are the implications of the regulations promulgated by a National Command Council that might find itself inviolated law.
Well, look, if it is not legal, then of course all the regulations would then be basically null and void. I think that's, it becomes a constitutional issue whether the council was properly set up or not initially. But we've moved on. So, challenging it in court for regulations that were imposed, let's say in level 5 or level 4 going now into level 3, may not really achieve much.
Who exercises oversight over a body like the National Command Council? We still live in a constitutional democracy where Parliament should exercise oversight, where the Constitution is the supreme law of the country. So who exercises oversight over a body like the NCC?
Well, obviously you have the president of the country, but if there is a legal attack on rules and regulations that this body is bringing in, the court, the constitutional court, would have the final say. So, the Constitution is the overriding, the Constitutional Court is the overriding body in all of the promulgation of all law and regulations. So if a law is unfair, unreasonable, then that can be challenged by taking it to the Constitutional Court. So if it affects citizens' rights, and a law is promulgated that affects citizens' rights, that can be taken to the Constitutional Court. So, we're having quite a lot of court debate. I think Mfuzi was saying earlier, he was explaining some of the cases that are going to or are in the process of going to court. So, we shouldn't really have that situation. The whole idea is to actually try and get the country back on track, trying to stop the coronavirus and to prevent infection. We shouldn't be battling all these regulations in court, but it happens because regulations are brought in that are unfair. They're not properly thought out initially, and how are they going to affect the general citizens? The practical day-to-day implementation of some of these regulations, because they're so confusing and contradictory, most people in South Africa don't really understand what they should and what they shouldn't do. Should they move? Shouldn't they move? Should they walk their dog? Shouldn't they walk their dog? This whole debate about liquor, the tobacco industry, the president says one thing, minister issues regulations which seem to be contrary to that. So you've got to have some kind of consistency. And at the end of the day, all these regulations have to be fair. I know we're in unique times, but the rights of the citizens can't just be ignored in all of this. And if a law is brought in that is contrary to the Constitution, we must challenge that. And the Constitutional Court can rule on the law. And whether
fair and reasonable. Mr. Notjezi, I believe got you back in the room now. So welcome. I hope your line is better. I'm going to try one more time. Just on the capacity issue, do you think the NPA has the capacity to proceed with all of these prosecutions, 230,000 arrests and counting?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, the starting point is that already we have an undercapacity. Remember, in the NPA was still trying to fill up about 700 vacant posts, as I understand, the last time. Now, if we look onto these cases that have arisen since the state of disaster, I doubt very much that the NPA would have capacity to deal with these cases. In any way, to me, these regulations were not really intended to criminalize people, but rather were directed at the issues of health and ensuring that there is adherence and the safe measures are being implemented to protect the very people. One has to be very slow in pushing hard for criminalization of the people. There's some way. To directly answer your question, I don't think the the NPA has necessary capacity to deal with this. I would have loved, with your permission, also to weigh into the role of the National Council of the Council.
Absolutely.
My viewpoint is that the question to ask in both the challenge as well as the in those cases. And I quite agree with their argument. I quite agree. In the National Council, we have some people that we do not know who are they, who elected them, how they got there. When the act is very clear, for instance, that it is the responsibility of the national executive. The national executive being a constitution and council, there are some people that are not members of the National Council, or some members of the National Executive are not part of the council. That becomes a very problematic, to me, that falls foul of the Constitution, because we know that there must be an office. What is critical at this stage, when there is an infringement upon the rights of the individual, when there is an element of suspension of the Constitution, there must be a strict oversight and transparent process that must be followed, so that we do understand exactly who take these decisions, how are these decisions being scrutinized, and how are they monitored, the implementation. I think Mr. Bush has dealt in details, for instance, with the abuses that we have often witnessed during the lockdown. So I just want I wanted to touch as well onto that. Look, the court challenge, there's a merit in the court challenge on the whole of the council itself.
And that's an important point to raise here, because we are ultimately, as Mogoeng, the Chief Justice, said, a constitutional democracy. William, I did read somewhere that the admission of guilt fines leading to criminal records might be expunged. Have you heard anything further about that?
I haven't, but the Criminal Procedure Act does allow for expungement of a criminal record for less serious offences, but that takes that's after 10 years. But you can challenge admission of guilt fines in court to have it set aside if you raise a good defence and why you paid it. But I think we need to really look at this whole issue of admission of guilt fines, and that they do not lead to a criminal record. There's some legislation, the Firearms Control Act, for example, allows for administrative fines, and the Immigration Act also allows for administrative fines, where it doesn't lead to a criminal record. So something seriously needs to be done about all of these admission of guilt fines where people have paid the admission of guilt. And the public needs to be told, this is how you go about having that set aside, so that where people paid it unbeknown and not aware of the law. So the whole capacity, you mentioned the capacity of the NPA. I mean, how can they deal with all these offences? And you're criminalising behaviour which normally would not be criminalised. And in some instances, these are really, really petty offences. And to end up having a criminal record where it's a petty offence is unacceptable. So I think legislation must now be brought in. I see the Deputy National Director said the other day they would only be prosecuting, let's say, 25% of these offences, but they've got to be all looked at. And I think legislation must be brought in to look at those petty offences and say those that paid admission of guilt fines can have those set aside by approaching the magistrates' court, for example, not even the High Court. So bringing in some regulation which allows that to take place, where people, not realizing that they could end up having a criminal record, can approach the court with the necessary, let's say, affidavit to have that record set aside.
Because it is about access at the end of the day, and we know it is very costly. If you go into the High Court, it takes a lot of time as well. If you feel you were wrongfully arrested as a result of the lockdown and the regulations, are you entitled to sue the state for wrongful arrest?
Yes, of course you can. So, you know, for anybody who's wrongfully arrested, but I think particularly now that you've had so many people that I believe were wrongfully arrested and they were not advised of their rights. And some of them were kept in custody for 24 hours, where the regulations actually said that people arrested for petty offences must be immediately released, where the police, in fact, directors from at highest level were saying, do not arrest people for those offences. It's unnecessary. So if that has happened, then you can approach, you can approach a court to sue the state for unlawful arrest. And of course, if you were detained in a police cell during that time for unlawful detention. And even if you've got to go and appear in court for all of that cost that is involved. So again, we are making so many issues about how the regulations were implemented when it didn't have to be done in that way. If you had trained law enforcement officers aware of the law, dealing with this. Now, why can't you go up to somebody and say, listen, you're walking your dog, please take your dog back. Why does that person have to be arrested? Or you on your way to, in fact, some people who've gone to shops and chemists genuinely have been arrested for doing it when they were entitled to. So that is what makes this whole situation ridiculous. Those people are entitled to approach the courts. But again, end of the day, it's the taxpayer who is to pay for all this court action if the Minister of Police or other law enforcement are sued and they have to pay out compensation. At the end of the day, that's money that must be paid by the taxpayer. So maybe one has to start citing individual law enforcement officers in their personal capacity because they didn't comply with the law. Things could have been dealt with in a far more effective and reasonable and fair way than they have. And it just causes more tension, more anger amongst normal law-abiding citizens. And that is not what this is all about.
That was going to be my next point. There's got to be some incentive mechanism that can be employed to ensure that the drafters of irrational regulations are held to account for their actions and not just fall back on the safety net of taxpayer-funded relief. With level 3 coming to effect next week, how does that impact access to the courts? As I said in my introduction, and to both you and Mr. Norchezi offline, lots of things have been happening on Zoom at the moment, from inductions to criminal court cases as well. How does access to the courts now change under level 3?
Well, obviously that the courts are becoming more open, as it were. So in level 4, access to the courts, let's say by way of Zoom, is all very well if you're arguing a matter. So if you were the judge and I was the lawyer and we were arguing issues, that's fine. But it's very difficult, if not impossible, to run a trial where you have a prosecutor, a judge or magistrate, you have witnesses, you have an accused person. You can't really run that all on Zoom. The courts don't have the facilities for that. So yes, if you're arguing a matter in the Supreme Court of Appeal or an appeal in the lower court or maybe at the Constitutional Court, that is all possible with the right facility. But it's not possible doing a bail application in the lower court on Zoom. So there's been a major problem throughout South Africa because all the courts seem to be imposing their own kind of rules. So one court you can allow cases to continue. Another court says, no, you can't. Then you have prosecutors becoming ill. You have police stations closing down because police officers become ill. So there's been lack of consistency, even though the Minister of Justice has issued regulations, and even though there are directives from the various judge presidents in South Africa and from certain of the magistrates' courts, there's been uncertainty about what happens in one court and what's happening in another court. So you'll go to court A and find no cases are being run except bail applications, urgent matters. Then you'll go to another court and you'll find that trials are being run. And, you just don't know from one day to the next. And then you'll go to that court where you think you're going to have a trial run and they're being run, and they tell you, no, we've closed down because 4 of the prosecutors or members of staff or admin staff have been affected with corona. And the sanitization at the courts doesn't exist, Michael, and the police stations. I mean, it is just a hotbed for infection.
And that's really what we were doing this for at the end of the day, buying time to ensure that we equip the economy with the right measures to be able to curb the spread through adequate sanitization and sanitary measures and protective personal gear and all of the rest of it. We're going to be closing the poll now, so I just want to run through some of the responses so far. And the key question to the poll was, my key sentiment now that we're moving to lockdown level 3 is 9% are very happy, 36%, and the majority are somewhat satisfied, 10% are disappointed, and a third are talking about the ban of tobacco's products, say that the ban of tobacco's products should have been lifted. Now, and then there was a final question on schools reopening. 10% agree that schools shouldn't have been reopened. So just on the basis of that, I want to zoom in on the tobacco issue. And the tobacco issue is one that's caused a great deal of debate. There are very well-known linkages through the illicit tobacco trade to very senior politicians. We had Johan van Lochenberg of SARS and many of his colleagues tainted under rogue narrative that was disproved on the back of the investigations that we're doing into the shady underworld. On the basis that so far we've been presented very little evidence, scientific evidence, that banning the sale of tobacco products will improve the fight against COVID-19. Is this open now to a potential legal challenge? The petitions online, depending on where you go to Facebook or other online petitions, run into the hundreds of thousands now. What is your opinion on the ban of the sale of tobacco products?
Well, not being a smoker myself, I can't see the connection between stopping COVID-19 and smoking. I think there was some talk online about, because somebody who smokes might be more likely to pick up some or other illness than somebody else. But I mean, I don't see any scientific link between smokers and the spread of corona. And, the whole tobacco industry brings in massive revenue. I mean, one can link that now with the sale of alcohol. I mean, level 3, yes, alcohol will be sold, but level 5 and level 4. So it couldn't. So you had a massive impact on 2 huge industries in South Africa. And the tobacco industry, there's a lot of illegal tobacco trade, even before corona. So we're talking about legitimate. And what has happened with stopping tobacco sales, legitimate sales, that just leads the way to more illegal and illicit tobacco trade, which is what everybody's trying to stop. And the questions are, why? Who's got interest in this? Where are the interests lying? And there's discussions about certain high-ranking officials, politicians who have links to the tobacco trade and that have an interest in it being stopped, and your legitimate tobacco companies ceasing trading. That for them that is a benefit. So we're going to still have more challenge to the tobacco industry. And at the end of the day, the country needs the money. The country cannot have a situation where your wine trade, let's say in the Western Cape, is completely and utterly destroyed. Your export of wine is stopped. Why? You know, it doesn't make sense. I suppose with the wine, they say, well, shebeens are then open, or people are illegally trading, but they're legally trading anyway in cigarettes and tobacco and in alcohol. So if it was properly dealt with, and if they went to the producers and said, how can we bring this in to, you know, in a pandemic situation, how can we allow you to produce, have income, generate income in the country, but at the same time follow the safety regulations? Why don't they talk to people before bringing in a lot of these silly regulations, which are, in my view, most instances confusing?
And I mean, if you're going to take that line, one might as well ban the sale of sugary drinks, because they lead to diabetes and other comorbidities like obesity, which are linked to COVID-19. And absence any of that rational explanation or evidence-based policy making, it's unsurprising to see some of the conspiracy theories doing the rounds and gaining credence as well. I just want to move on to the final part here, and again apologize for Mr. Norchezi's internet connection. It's the way of the new world that we're living in, but fortunately we've had the very loquacious William Booth, who has helped with many of your questions. There's still so many that are unanswered at this stage. When it comes to the workplace, William, I know criminal law is really your thing, but would it be seen as an unfair dismissal if you were to dismiss an employee perhaps for not following particular health and safety protocol, like mandatory mask wearing, for example?
I would believe not. So if an employer says, look, I'm not coming to work because you do not have you didn't properly sanitize the workplace, and there's no proper soap and other sanitary products available, and there are no masks available. I think, and as I say, well, as you say, Michael, I'm not an expert in labor law. We'd have to speak to Michael Bagram and ask his input in that regard. But I would say the person would be fully justified, because it's there, put in place to prevent the spread of corona. And we know that, you know, in some instances where places haven't been sanitized, corona has spread, and where people haven't worn masks or haven't been properly sanitized. So I think the employee would be fully justified in saying, I'm not going to work until you put in place all these requirements. But in fact, I think certain of the regulations dealing with allowing certain companies to open have put that, you know, that is part of some of the regulations. And now in level 3, when I think all companies can open, you're still going to have the distancing and sanitization and all of that. But that is, as far as I can recall, is part of the regulations. So that it is a requirement. If you're opening a business and you've got so many people, you've got to have X, Y, and Z in place to prevent the spread of the infection. So if you say, as an employer, I'm not going to work because it isn't in place, I think you'd be entitled and fully justified in doing that. That from a criminal defense lawyer.
And that's from a criminal defense lawyer who can obviously dabble in a bit of labor law as well. I might ask you a bit of family law as well. What happens to those parties who might want to get divorced at this time?
Well, yes, I think in the beginning one couldn't approach court. So, you know, the whole process of issuing summons and all of that was stopped. But I think now you're in the process that courts are opening, and in terms of the directives from the High Court, that you would be able to institute process. But the courts still would look at the most serious cases and look at instances where, you know, you might have situations of too many people in court and saying, well, that can't take place. But I think issuing summons and having that take place with regard to a divorce matter, I think that would be, that is possible now. And, you know, online even, but I suppose you've got to serve the summons on the other party. So you'd have to have the sheriff of the court going and taking the documentation to serve on the other party. So that, I think, particularly in level 3, that process will be in place.
I want to circle back to the cigarettes because there was another issue with Minister Cele's comments around having to provide a till receipt or some form of receipt as to where you purchased your cigarettes to see whether or not they were pre or after the lockdown. I don't know in the illicit world if you issued with a receipt, but is that legitimate? Certainly in terms of Section 35 of the Constitution, it's unconstitutional.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, you're entitled to possess cigarettes. And if you might have collected prior to the lockdown, let's say 20 cartons, because you could see what was going to happen, I mean, you wouldn't have the receipt anyway. But you don't have to answer that question. So if a police officer stops you and you've got, or comes into your house, in fact, the other day I had a matter where they raided a person's house and found 50 cartons of cigarettes, arrested the person for illegally purchasing and or selling, but there was no proof of that. So you don't have to give a receipt if you're in possession, because it's not illegal to be in possession of cigarettes. And it is quite ridiculous to have said that, because where do you ever keep receipts? I mean, if you knew about it beforehand, but you may have thought it sensible to keep your receipts in your pocket. But otherwise, why? I mean, it's just, it's ludicrous. And that's why you have people at high level saying things that the public listen to. And then you have massive debates about actually what the person said was wrong, contrary to the regulation. So you'd think that somebody in that situation would know what the law is. And I wonder whether he did, with all due respect to him, because to say something like that, I believe is totally and utterly irresponsible.
Just for clarity, as we come to the end of our time, 3 minutes left here. So after the 1st of June, I can travel from Johannesburg to Durban, or I can travel across borders without a permit. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I understand it. And in fact, flights are also going to take place for business purposes. But we're not quite sure how that is going to be regulated. So obviously, if you've got to have proof that you're going to go and consult with somebody in Johannesburg, you've got to fly there, you've got a court case. Because at the moment, if you've got a court case in Johannesburg, you could travel there as a lawyer, but you can't fly there. So you've got to travel up through 3 provinces to go and attend a case in the Johannesburg High Court. But it looks like level 3 will allow all of that travel. How they're going to, kind of, let's say, police the issue about business travel, I'm not quite sure. You might just have to have some proof that you have to go to a court or attend a business meeting or consult with clients in whatever profession you're in.
Lots of comments coming through on the tobacco side of things. And as an ex-smoker, I haven't, fortunately, smoked for several years now. I can understand their frustration, and I can just understand the points of law that are being raised here and the points that you raised earlier, William, around the loss to the fiscus. And I'll come back to this then as a concluding comment. Isn't it time, therefore, that we see this matter head to the courts and be settled once and for all? I know FITA have got an application. British American Tobacco withdrew a potential application. One wonders what happened behind the scenes and whether or not they might come back. But if you chat to someone like Johan van Lochrenberg, he says it's not just the smaller players and those who are linked to illicit tobacco, it's the larger players as well who are benefiting from this environment. Isn't it time just to take it to court once and for all?
Yes, it probably is. But shouldn't people be speaking to each other? We run to court with many cases, and that's fine. As a lawyer, I welcome that. And we must make sure the Constitution is upheld. And that is why you go to court. Why do you have to have all these potential court cases? Because everybody should know the Constitution and look at the bigger picture, and hopefully then bring in something that is in the best interest of everybody. So maybe talk to all the role players. But if that doesn't work well, I think they must go to court to have this clarified immediately, and the government must come and say why it shouldn't happen. And because the more you disallow something, the more, as we've discussed earlier, you're going to have the illicit trade. I mean, the banning of alcohol in the United States of America in the 30s, I mean, that just led to more and more crime. So
the prohibition, yeah. If you want more of something, often ban it, and you'll see exactly what happens. I think the lessons are writ large in history. As Churchill once said, the further in history you look, the more likely you are to see the outcomes into the future. And with that, thank you very much. We've reached the end of our time, William, and I must thank you for all of your considered insights. And apologies again to the delegates for the technical issues that we had with Mr. Nochezi's line. He does send his apologies as well. That was William Booth, Criminal Law Committee Chairperson and Cape Town attorney, who is also a member of the Law Society of South Africa. He serves on the Legal Aid Committee of the Law Society of South Africa, who we must thank as well for sponsoring this webinar, and to the Mail and Guardian as well. Thank you as always for putting together an exceptional webinar. I'm sure there's another one up soon. I think you're going to be discussing estates and wills planning. So hopefully one can get that all done under level 3 now. If you haven't already, I'm sure you've had a lot of time to sit at home and think about how you're going to do that. William, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
And let's hope that some sanity will prevail. Cheers.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks.